Well, our scripture today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 10. We have been working through that. We're in the second week of our series on how to be disciples, living as disciples of Jesus Christ. And we're kind of walking along with Jesus through the Gospels over the next couple of weeks. This is the second week of 4. And so our scripture comes in verses 38 to 42 of the Gospel of Luke. You may have heard this story. I'll read it for us. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." This is the word of the Lord for us today. You can follow along. It's printed on the back page of your bulletins. Well, anybody like to make lists and get stuff done? Yeah? So anybody who's a list maker, are you listening to this and going, "Oh boy, I'm like the bad guy in this story," right? All of those type A driven people who like to do lots of things in quick succession. Sometimes I think when we hear this passage, we can feel a little bit looked down upon. And Mary, who is the one who seems to just be able to serenely and calmly let everything go and focus on Jesus. And so Jesus, in a way, that's a little bit like what we often hear about this story, about Mary and Martha. Martha's just trying to get stuff done, and she's frustrated, so she's going to Jesus to try and tell him to sort it out. And so that's kind of the gist of the story. It's the way that it tends to be read and understood. But I would like to try and poke out maybe some other insights into this. I think it's a little more subtle, perhaps a little more nuanced than that. And so maybe we'll explore that today and see, for those of us who like to make lists and get things done, if there may be another way to understand this as well. I think, as a contrast to what we often hear, that perhaps this is not about setting Mary up as the good disciple and Martha as the bad one. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. So Jesus stops in this story at the home of Mary and Martha after he passes through the region of Samaria. And so we see that, as is usually interpreted, the story kind of pits these two women against each other, Mary and Martha, kind of as a way of focusing on Mary, right? Mary is the more favored and righteous of the two sisters. She's sitting at Jesus' feet, whereas Martha is kind of in the doghouse. And so Martha, being so distracted by fixing dinner and cleaning up and all these domestic duties that Mary doesn't seem to care about, she is actually scolded by Jesus, because she didn't put them aside, and she didn't join Mary. And so the lesson, of course, we often read is, don't be like Mary, or Martha, be like Mary. Martha bad, Mary good, right? Take time to listen to Jesus. Don't be distracted by your housework or all those duties that you have to do. But even as I tell this story, and even as I share that interpretation, I struggle a little bit with it, because I think, is it that simple? Is it really? Do we have to place these two powerful women, these two influential women in the early church, as adversaries to each other? Is it an either-or kind of conversation? So I want to poke that out a little bit. And actually, if we look into the text a little bit more deeply, what we find is that it's not so simple. First, what this shows us is that there is clear and convincing evidence that women were active as leaders in the early stages of the Jesus movement. This isn't the only example of women who were leaders in the early church, but this is an interesting one. So in this story, we see women who are referred to by their own names, Mary and Martha, as opposed to being identified by their relationship with a man. That's a unique thing in the ancient world. And women who host Jesus in their home. It's an interesting point. So if you look in Luke's version of the story that we're reading here, they're not identified as the sisters of Lazarus. So you know about Lazarus, who's raised up from the dead in John, the Gospel of John. They're not identified as his sisters, but their own people. Rather, it identifies them as Mary and a woman named Martha who welcomed Jesus into her home. Her home, not Lazarus's home, right? So she owns this home where Jesus has been invited and welcomed. So it wasn't unheard of in the ancient world for a woman to own property, but it would have been unusual. So there were only certain circumstances under which women were legally allowed to own property in the ancient world, and very few women met that criteria. But here we have one. We have a woman who owned her home, and Jesus is welcomed into it. And so I think that's an important detail. If we're looking at a story where Martha gets the bad rap, it's kind of interesting that she is the one who owns the home. She's the one who's invited Jesus in. So there's clearly a position of influence for both of these women, Mary and Martha. So I don't think it's unintentional that Luke provided that detail. Calls them by their own names, not related in relation to Lazarus, even though they're related, and that it's in Martha's home. So here's what I think. Sometimes we read this story and it says, Martha's distracted by her many tasks of preparation and assume, because of usual roles in the home, that she's just getting ready for dinner. She's getting all her stuff together, right? She's making food. Mary's just sitting around not doing anything, and she's upset. That's kind of the way we understand it. However, the text actually doesn't say anything about an elaborate meal being prepared. It doesn't say anything about that. And in fact, there's a very interesting term that Luke uses to describe what Martha is doing, the many tasks with which she's occupied in the passage. And the word that he uses in Greek is diakonian. So it sounds a little bit like the word deacon, doesn't it? Diakonian. And that's because the work she's doing isn't housework, it appears. And the word in Greek more has a context of an activity, or of being a spokesperson, or of waiting tables, or of service, which is why we still have the word deacon. Service. She was occupied with a lot of serving things. She was doing a lot of service. And so in Luke Acts, if you were to read more usages of that word, it more means participation with others in leadership and ministry on behalf of the community. She wasn't just cooking a meal. So what Martha and Mary are doing is serving, diakonia, serving in leadership in the church. So A, it's not just about a meal. B, maybe Martha's having a bigger conversation, right, with Jesus. And so what we may be seeing here is that Martha is serving in ministry and that she's distracted by much ministry, by a lot of work, and a lot of things. And maybe, perhaps, the conversation she's having with Jesus is about being exhausted. And it's sometimes when we're exhausted, it's easy to kind of place the blame on somebody, isn't it? It's Mary's fault because she doesn't help me. Jesus, can you do something about it? Right? So Martha's talking to Jesus about Mary. So she's distracted by many things, as Jesus says. And so perhaps Martha is overwhelmed a little bit. She and Mary are key leaders in the church, doing a lot of good things. Maybe Martha's just, she's been on full throttle for a little too long, and she needs to pull back a little bit. And so that gives us perhaps a different way of looking at this story and this passage. And it brings to light a question for me. What if I keep getting these confused. What if Martha's chief complaint isn't that Mary is failing to help with the housework, but rather that she isn't keeping up with her ministerial duties? Maybe it's a larger conversation. Finally, Martha has a chance to talk to Jesus. He's right there in the house with her. And the one thing she can think to say is, sort Mary out. Wonder how long she's been waiting to have that conversation while he's been off in Samaria. Jesus, you're finally here. Help. Fix it. Right? And so perhaps Martha thinks Mary's spending too much time studying in the office, leaving Martha to do all the busy work. And so I wonder if instead of putting these two women in opposition to one another, we see them as co-leaders in the work of the church, and they're just trying to figure out how it's going to work. Martha's a little frustrated and a little overwhelmed, and as we often are when we're frustrated and overwhelmed, she's trying to find an easy way to fix it. Jesus, right? And so it's an intriguing insight. It reframes Jesus' teaching moment with Martha. Because what if it's not about housework? What if it's about how to handle the burdens of doing good in our lives? See, we all have opportunities to do good in our contexts. And I think that sometimes we can have this narrow view of ministry, right? Well, ministry is standing up in a pulpit. Ministry is leading worship. But ministry is any time we help one another and we give grace and mercy and we sacrifice of ourselves. That's ministry. Every one of us, by God's grace, as followers of Christ, does ministry when we love one another. That's what it is. And it can be a lot sometimes, right? For all of us. And so I think the question in this story is, how do we balance the doing and the being in our lives? How do we do that? It's not just about church leaders. It's about all of us. How do we do that? So I want to give us a couple of concrete examples of non-churchy ministry that we can think about. A couple of life settings that I think happen to a lot of us, just so that we can imagine it. And maybe as I'm doing that, you can think about even of yourself or people you love and the things that they're involved in their lives, how we can be overwhelmed. Here's one. A 48-year-old woman's married, has teenage children involved in many activities, as well as a parent who's fighting cancer and needing hospice care. That's one. 16-year-old young man involved in high school, sports, church activities. And he's supporting his younger siblings as a big brother as he prepares to go to college. You don't have to be old. You can be real busy as a kiddo, as a young person. Or a 67-year-old grandfather who's retired, but he's still passionately involved in helping with his son's farm during planting and harvest. And in addition, he and his wife watch the grandkids several days a week to help with the exorbitant costs of childcare. And then they also volunteer at church. See, these are normal circumstances, right? These are things that we all are dealing with in our lives. When we have these relationships, people that we care about, we want to try and help each other. And we are involved in many things, right? Ministry isn't just standing at a pulpit preaching. It's any time we ease the burden for others. It's any time we offer ourselves sacrificially in care for another person as Christ has done for us. And we do it in a million different ways all the time, all of us. See, we're ministers in our homes and in our workplaces, among our friends and our families, and at times it can be exhausting, can't it? It can be draining. Caring for others can deplete us if we're not careful about how we pay attention to our own inner lives. And so Jesus has these words of loving caution to Martha. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, verse 41, you are worried and upset about many things. But few things are needed, or only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will be not be taken away from her. So are we worried and upset today about many things? Are we anxious? Have we been holding some things too long? So the question for me isn't busy bad, not busy good. I think that's a little bit too simple of an answer. My question to us is, how do we lay them down? Because Jesus knew what people were dealing with. Life was hard then. Life is hard now sometimes. It's always been that way. We are always going to have lots of things to occupy our attention. But the question is, can we set them down? Can we set them aside and spend time with God? See, I don't think the problem was that Martha had a lot to deal with. We all have a lot to deal with. I think the problem was that she couldn't put it down. And that when she had the opportunity to be with the Lord, she tried to get him to do something. She didn't just sit with him and just receive his presence. She was so anxious and so worried that occupied all her attention, even when she was with Jesus. couldn't put it down. So how do we put our stuff down long enough? Long enough to spend time with God. See, I suspect Mary wasn't lazy. You know what? I'll bet Mary worked really hard too. I'll bet she did her fair share, but in that moment, when the opportunity came, when her Lord was there, Mary stopped. She put down her many things, and she focused on Jesus. So Jesus' word to Martha is, stop. You're worried about so many things. Just put them down. You don't have to carry them all yourself. Stop. And so I think there are times when we can plan for moments in our day to stop and spend quiet time with God. Sometimes they take us by surprise. And so I think this passage reminds us of how important it is to be willing to lay our agendas down just for a little bit. Just lay them down and rest in Jesus' presence. And then to recognize the need for balance. To recognize also those spontaneous moments when there might be an opportunity to rest in Jesus' presence. And so I just want to invite that as an alternate way to look at this story. I don't think Mary was lazy. I don't think Martha was cooking a meal. I think they were both serving the Lord in leadership in the church. And Jesus was just helping Martha to see sometimes you have to lay it down and spend time in his presence. And so I wanted to just take a